So this is the ChurchState module. I'm Justin Bathen, and this is Law for Teachers. So this is a relatively short module, and I don't want to go into a ton of detail here. I just want to give you some baseline concepts in church and state in the hopes that you can use this baseline balancing through the rest of your career to try and walk this very fine line that Congress has set up for us with religion in the United States. So if you go and you read the First Amendment, and the text is there in red, you see that there are actually two religion clauses in the First Amendment. First, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or, number two, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, lots of times in society, these two work perfectly fine, and they don't really interact that much with each other. But public schools present just like the most likely place for these two clauses to come head to head in the United States, it seems. You know, public schools and religion really struggle. For whatever reasons, because you have a public entity potentially establishing a religion, and you have a private actors like school board actors or parents or kids wanting to freely exercise their religion. So those two things struggle to go together frequently. And so let's talk a little bit about both of those, and you'll see a little bit how they struggle and sort of which of those two seems to win on a general basis. So first, in public schools, the free exercise clause makes religion a protected class. And when something becomes a protected class, and you'll see it a couple times in this semester, it becomes really important that we protect any potential discrimination against that, right? So once religion becomes a protected class, there has to be a compelling interest and narrowly tailoring of policy to discriminate against religion. In essence, it's really, really hard to discriminate against religion, and there has to be a compelling case to do so. And sometimes we do see such a compelling case, like you need to be a Catholic to be the principal of a Catholic school. So we see those types of cases from time to time, but it's hard and it need a lot of justification. And in the public school context, there's really just not a lot of reason for us to be discriminating against religion, with one huge exception, and that is when a government seeks to establish a religion. Okay, so the establishment clause is a compelling interest that gets us out of the potential discriminatory impact under the free exercise clause. And I know I'm going back and forth a lot. I'll try and keep free exercise clause here and establishment here. And what you see is establishment is sort of the primary statute when it comes to public schools, because it is the exception to this rule. All right. So when school districts or your local classroom even are trying to establish a law, that is when we get into problems. Now, what the heck is all this establishment clause stuff? That's a good question, right? So you know, Thomas Jefferson laid out hundreds of years ago that the clause on establishment of religion was intended to erect a separation of church and state. And that clause has stuck with us in the United States. I mean, he was there when they wrote the thing, so I think he knew what it meant, probably. But nevertheless, like, we have really struggled with the establishment clause, and we really do not create a big, huge brick wall like that graphic shows between church and state, and frequently we do have some overlap existing between the two of them. And I'll give you an extreme example that obviously makes the point for me. Every single time Congress, the United States Congress, opens a new session, what do? They pray. So, I mean, we're crossing these boundaries all the time. It is when we cross these boundaries that has certain impacts that we try to avoid. Okay, so the Supreme Court has laid out what those impacts are over time. Needs to have a secular purpose. That a law needs to neither advance nor impede religion to be okay, and it has to avoid an excessive entanglement with religion and schools. Over the years, we've added on to that three-part test by making sure that the law neither advances nor disapproves any particular religion. And the one that I personally like the best, but you can feel free to make your own decisions here, is that any particular religious practice cannot have a coercive effect. And when we talk about schools, and especially the younger the child, the more potentially coercive our actions in schools can be. So those are the 5 things that you should be thinking about when you are talking about religion in school. This is really how we balance it. Does it have a secular purpose? Does it neither advance nor impede? Does it avoid excessive entanglement? Neither endorse nor disapprove, and not have a coercive effect? If all of those things are satisfied, you can probably mix religion and your classroom. How often are all of those things satisfied? Sometimes they are, sometimes it's not. It's really difficult. The courts have been struggling with this issue for generations, and they will continue to struggle with this issue for generations into the future. It is just something about public school classrooms and religion that don't seem to mix well and just cause tons of litigation. So you, as a teacher, just need to be walking this fine line and trying to make just generally intelligent decisions as we go through. So here's some practical impacts of this, right? So answer constitutional or unconstitutional. So proselytization in the classroom, is that constitutional or unconstitutional? I would hope you would go with unconstitutional there. It is always, always, always unconstitutional. We're never going to let that go. You can't use the teacher's desk as a pulpit from which to preach the Bible, the Quran, or whatever. Just can't do it. It is absolutely always wrong in the United States. Next question. What about religious-based holidays? Let's say Easter. Is that constitutional or unconstitutional? Well, let's call Easter spring break, right? And then we can say that maybe that's constitutional. So, we try to find ways around this. Obviously, you're aware of this huge debate in the country between, the holiday season or the Christmas season. That's, the culture wars that are in impact. Well, we're trying to get around some of these constitutional provisions when schools call things holiday break versus Christmas break. So you can just see that's sort of what's going on in that space. And so what about religious displays? Usually not in this space. I would say it's usually unconstitutional, with the exception of like posters that say under God, or I pledge allegiance to the flag, that whole thing with under God in it. So when we're using God in that way, or in God we trust, these sort of national references to God, those seem to have been okay in the courts. What about this? So this happens in schools pretty frequently. Some of you might go out there and be coaches of various things. What about praying around sporting events? What about prayer in general? So as long as this stuff is sort of student-led, it seems to be okay in the courts. But anytime this becomes sort of a teacher-led or coach-led activity, it probably is unconstitutional. Just something to keep in mind throughout your career. We have had issues come up around attendance, Amish children, Muslim children wanting to pray throughout the day. And generally, we have sort of accommodated those different religious backgrounds and requests. There's a great Amish case, Wisconsin versus Yoder, that gave Amish kids the right to not attend school because of their religious beliefs. And so that's where religious beliefs come in. You see that cited sometimes. Well, that's because we provide some flexibility in that space. So you might wind up in a private school, and if you do, good for you. Congrats on getting the job, right? Now, private schools clearly are different in that there is no worry about establishment of religion because it's not a public entity. Therefore, it's much more free exercise driven and discrimination driven rather than establishment clause driven. So just be aware of that. And as long as there's no public money, we really watch the money with private schools. Sometimes money moves around and public dollars help support private schools. When that's the case, then private schools cannot be acting in a religious manner. They have to act like a public entity. So just be aware of that throughout your careers. I'm going to leave you with a scenario around the Equal Access Act. Okay, so here is your challenge. What about this scenario? And I'll leave this up here at the end so you can pause and read it. What about this scenario in the context of the Equal Access Act? I've linked up the actual statute. Go read the actual statute and see if within that statute how you would decide this scenario, okay? And leave your comments in the discussion board.